The game section of the App Store is like a petri dish that's been left to ferment for 15 years. And each time I catch a glimpse of what's going on inside that petri dish, I am left revolted and horrified. I know it's become a running joke to point out how bad the mobile game market is, but just because something is cliche to say doesn't mean it's not worth closer inspection. And actually, I think that all of this gawking at the ridiculousness and dishonesty of mobile game ads, as fun as that is to do, obfuscates a much sadder truth hiding below. So let's start with some context. Mobile games make a boatload of money. In 2022 alone, they made $91.8 billion, accounting for half of all revenue companies brought in from video games. And yes, that's right, mobile gaming brings in more money than PC and console gaming do combined. And similar to a handful of other digital industries, the COVID-19 pandemic ended up being a boon to the mobile games industry. Mobile game revenue reached an all-time high back in 2021 and has held relatively steady since. And how do they make all of this money? Well, video ads, display ads, and in-app purchases mostly. Long gone are the days where you just paid 99 cents to play Doodle Jump, and you could just play Doodle Jump. Around a decade ago, mobile developers and publishers realized that having a user pay a set price for a game naturally puts a limit on how much money they can make off of a given player. And so, the free-to-play model came onto the scene. By adding ads and in-app purchases to a game, that revenue cap is, in effect, raised to infinity. And it didn't take too long for the free-to-play model to take over the App Store either. Freemium app revenue eclipsed that of traditional paid apps all the way back in 2011, only 3 years after the App Store opened its doors to developers. And from there, well, you know the story. We've seen a surge of annoying to downright manipulative monetization practices, milking money out of all sorts of players, from whales to naive children. But if that wasn't bad enough, the games themselves arguably have gotten worse because of this. For example, tedium is now an essential part of game design for mobile games. For those who are impatient, what's another $4 to speed along the growth of your kingdom or to unlock some new skin? And for those who stuck it out, well, thanks for watching all those ads and for reinforcing your susceptibility to the sunk cost fallacy. As a case study, let's take Epic Games. I remember playing Infinity Blade over a decade ago on my iPod Touch and having the time of my life. And when it came out, Infinity Blade was the fastest grossing app in the history of iOS up until that point. I barely knew what was going on in the game lore-wise. I just hacked and slashed best I could. But I remember being in complete awe that I was playing this, in my mind, absolutely stunning game on an iPod Touch. And even as a kid, I had such a sense of optimism for what games could look like years down the line, as hardware improved and as devs got more and more creative. And you might say that I'm looking at things through rose-tinted glasses, and that may be true, but that being said, I'd love to go back and replay the Infinity Blade games to see for myself if they still hold up, but back in 2018, Epic Games removed the Infinity Blade trilogy from the App Store, citing how difficult optimizing the game became on more modern devices. And then, on August 28, 2020, the Infinity Blade games were removed altogether from all Apple users' purchase histories, after Apple terminated Epic's developer account, which was caused by Epic publicly challenging Apple's in-app purchase policies. A lot of peace there. So unless you had the foresight to download these games onto an iPhone years ago, these games are practically lost media. And would you look at that? These games became collateral damage in a squabble over game monetization. It's all just so sad. And if you look at the types of games that are currently available on the App Store, I'd say most of them fall into one of three categories. Either they're a mobile port of some console or PC game, a la Minecraft, GTA, Stardew Valley, or Five Nights at Freddy's. They're B, bingeable arcade or puzzle games, think Candy Crush or endless runners like Subway Surfers. Or C, multiplayer games, mostly strategy games and shooters. And even if you strip these games of the predatory monetization practices I just talked about, the lay of the land here still looks pretty bleak. For one, in my humble opinion, if a game was developed for mouse and keyboard or for controller, mobile ports will always be the inferior way of experiencing these games. Unless you buy additional peripherals for your phone, in which case you've sacrificed a fair amount of convenience, the main appeal of playing games on your phone, the control scheme must necessarily use the touchscreen for game input. And at that point, it's just a mess. Your fingers block half the screen, there's no tactility when you input something so you can more easily misclick. I'm just saying the handful of times I've tried it, it's been miserable. And then for these two other categories of games, they're fine. But you could hardly call any of these games boundary pushing. While it's nice to be able to instantly jump into a game whenever you have a few minutes, let's be honest, how much creativity really is on display in all of the endless runners out there? Has anyone ever said that their outlook on life was radically reshaped after playing Jetpack Joyride? I mean, there's a reason why these games are a dime a dozen. Conceptually, these games are very simple, so there's hardly any learning curve to new users. And from a mechanics standpoint, hardly any of these games take advantage of the unique properties of a mobile device as a medium for interactive experiences. I mean, think about it. The touchscreen, the gyroscope, haptics, cameras, microphones, the very fact that the screen fits in the palm of your hand. These are all things that are taken for granted in modern smartphones, and yet hardly any games out there use them in any creative combination. Somehow, despite mobile gaming being a multi-billion-dollar industry, perusing the App Store nowadays lays bare the ugly truth that these companies do not care about doing anything new or interesting. After years of churning out unimaginative junk, they've created a landscape where players now preconceive mobile games themselves as being simple, exploitative, or bottom of the barrel. And because of this, they have no incentive to experiment or deviate from their formula. They've made their bed, and now they're more than content to lie in it. But what if things were different? Every now and again, there's one game for iOS that, even over a decade after its release, I still find myself thinking about all the time. And that's because, for once, I had found a game that treated the iPhone with, well, respect as a platform. And because of that respect, the developers were able to identify, bend, and break the rules of mobile game design, creating an immersive experience that, as far as I'm aware, simply has no parallel. It's a relic of a simpler time, where game design philosophies for smartphones weren't as quite set in stone. And in light of this, I think that this game holds the key to making mobile games exciting again. And the game I'm talking about is Device 6. Device 6 is a 2013 text-based puzzle game made for iOS by Swedish developer Simogo. Unlike other contemporary visual novels, which focused more on character, improved graphics, and expanding pre-existing game mechanics, Device 6 takes the idea of a visual novel and strips it back down to basics. And I don't mean to suggest that this makes it simple or boring, far from it. But by starting from scratch, Simogo allowed themselves to completely rethink how written fiction can be constructed in an interactive medium such as the iPhone. And oddly, for a game that's primarily text-based, it is incredibly immersive. And I think part of that is because it demands your full attention. When you first boot the game, for example, you're greeted with a notice telling you that it's impossible to play the game through without audio enabled. It also tells you to look at your Device 4 instruction manual, but we'll get to that later. And while this does erect a higher barrier to entry than most other mobile games, and you could potentially see this as a turnoff, I see it more as an invitation. With this disclaimer, you can tell from the get-go that this is a game that takes itself seriously. It promises you a finely crafted interactive experience that you can't get anywhere else, and I think it definitely delivers on that promise. But alright, maybe I'm reading too much into this, plus we're not even at the title screen yet. What's the actual game like? Well, essentially, there are 6 chapters, each of which contain their own set of puzzles you're tasked with solving. Whereas at first, the game feels like reading an ebook or scrolling through a web page, it very quickly evolves past that. As you continue to read, the text on the page begins to twist and turn, often mimicking the surroundings of the story's protagonist. This results in a story that is technically linear, but the experience of reading the story feels rather disjointed. After your first read-through of a given chapter, you find yourself constantly retracing your steps, whipping back and forth, exploring all possible forks in the story, reliving key moments and scenes, all in order to find the clues to a series of puzzles you've encountered along your way. Eventually, the experience of reading begins to feel more like following trails of breadcrumbs or finding needles in haystacks. And that's because portions of the text become representative of physical locations within the story. And so not only are you running back and forth through time as you reread each chapter, but you're also moving back and forth through space, technically, which is just really cool. And what I'm about to say may seem trivial at first, but the fact that you have to constantly adapt to reading the text by physically rotating your screen is just stupid brilliant. Whereas other mobile games and apps lock in your device orientation one way or another, Device 6 is an experience that's neither oriented solely vertically or in landscape. And because of this, you just can't replicate the experience of playing this game on any other kind of device. I'm sure I'm struggling as it is trying to replicate it for you while editing this video. This is a wonderful example of the developers acknowledging the unique characteristics of the iPhone and designing a game for it with those characteristics in mind. Whereas for most other games on the iPhone, this is never a consideration in a game's design. And this uncommon philosophy towards Device 6's game design leads its developers to even more inventive situations. Take this moment where the protagonist in the story walks through a mirror, which flips everything for her, but also for the player. Of course, the physical description of the room through the mirror is a reflection of the room you just came from, but also the sound you hear is now played in reverse. And most obviously, the text you read is printed backwards. To decipher what's happening, you realize you have to go find a mirror somewhere in real life and hold your phone up to it, while writing down on a sheet of paper anything important that you might need later. And not to sound like a broken record, but that's just so cool. My mind was blown when I got to this point. With this moment, the game no longer is just on your phone. In fact, the developers very intentionally blur the line between the game and the real world, not only in this moment, but throughout the rest of the game as well. And this effect is only compounded by the music and sound design. As you travel between rooms, the music and environmental sounds subtly shift in reaction to you scrolling, and oftentimes clues are found in the music or recordings that you hear. These are all simple, yet super effective ways of making a world of static text feel all the more dynamic. And again, it serves the purpose of making the experience all the more immersive. And all of this isn't just some gimmick either, it has thematic relevance to the game's plot as well. As you play Device 6, you follow the story of a woman named Anna after she wakes up in a seemingly abandoned castle, where she runs into a bunch of mysterious and imposing set pieces, from a ticket-taker monkey to a bunch of mannequins at tea time. And with each chapter, there are little footnotes outlining different types of devices. Devices 1 and 2, for example, translate Anna's thoughts and visual surroundings into the very text that you read. Device 4 is your phone, and so that means you as a player are directly integrated into the lore of the game. The text also acts as a sort of meta text. And I won't spoil everything in case you're curious to try the game out for yourself, but I think it's just such an interesting way to frame a game. In a weird way, you feel complicit in everything happening in the story with every flick and tap of your thumb, which all bring up the usual questions of free will and whatnot, but in a way that feels pretty fresh. Considering that this game came out back in 2013, it's incredibly prescient, raising all sorts of questions about our relationships with our devices. Sure, the idea of a company/cult kidnapping you and throwing you into a game is a little outlandish, but once you look at the story more as an allegory, things start to seem a bit more familiar. You can draw parallels between the story and how our phones quite literally suck up hours upon hours of our lives. Or you can see the story as a worrying tale about the pressure creatives face to spin their lives into sources of content. Or just consider all of the data extracted from our online activity, stripping down parts of ourselves into different demographic buckets to sell, something that mobile games past and present have been doing for years now. And smartphones have enabled all of this to happen. But it's precisely because Device 6 can only be played on a smartphone that these questions feel so personal. Well, actually, you can also play it on a tablet, but you get my point. And even though the game can be beaten in only a couple hours or so, it really speaks to the quality of the game that it says so much in that amount of time. But on the other hand, it's also a damning indictment of the innumerable time sinks that mark the mobile games market nowadays, most of which say absolutely nothing. Anyway, yeah, I'm just bummed out about mobile games. And oddly, most attempts to improve the mobile game space have their own set of problems. Apple, for instance, released Apple Arcade back in 2019, a subscription service that gives you access to over 200 games without advertisements, in-app purchases, or tracking. But while I think this is an interesting idea, the catalog leaves a bit to be desired. To justify a subscription service, most of these games have to be arcade-style games that you can sink lots of time into, so we see quite a few familiar faces on the list. And while there are plenty of other games available, the most recognizable ones aren't even exclusive to the iPhone, and in fact probably offer an inferior experience compared to other platforms. And now also Apple seems to really be leaning into attracting AAA studios to port games to iOS and to Mac. And while there is a novelty in being able to run these games in the palm of your hand, that novelty is really the only thing these games have going for them on the iPhone. It really does make me wonder what things would look like if the free-to-play craze didn't take root on the App Store. Would there be more space for different kinds of games? What would they look like? Or would it just be a matter of time before some other toxic monetization practice slithered its way in? Well, regardless, it's nice to dream at least. There's been a lot of talk about how 2023 has been the best year for video games, maybe ever, and that's all fine and good. But I do wish that our phones, these little devices we carry in our pockets most every day, received a little bit more love, offering gaming experiences wholly unique to them. And as we've seen, the tools are there to do just that. Someone just has to take the next step and build it. Anyway, I'd be curious to know if there are any other mobile games you hold dear from days past. Or maybe I'm completely wrong and there are inventive mobile games out there still, but I just haven't been digging hard enough. If anything comes to mind, let me know. I may not respond to every comment, but trust me, I do read them. Also, if you made it this far into the video, just wanted to let you know I started a Patreon if you care to support the work I do. Plus, to sweeten the deal, you'll also get some cat pictures, sneak peeks, and access to my own newsletter-esque post things that I'll be putting together every other week. And with that, this has been 1C2. Thanks for watching.